Chapter 7. That night I was wakened by a hurried tapping at my door, and before I could answer, Frances stood beside my bed. She had switched on the light as she came in. Her hair fell straggling over her dressing gown. Her face was deathly pale, its expression so distraught it was almost haggard. The eyes were very wide. She looked almost like another woman. She was whispering at a great pace. "Bill, Bill, wake up, quick!" "I am awake. What is it?" I whispered too. I was startled. "Listen," was all she said. Her eyes stared into vacancy. There was not a sound in the great house. The wind had dropped, and all was still. Only the tapping seemed to continue endlessly in my brain. The clock on the mantelpiece pointed to 2:30. "I heard nothing, Frances. What is it?" I rubbed my eyes. I had been very deeply asleep. "Listen," she repeated very softly, holding up one finger and turning her eyes towards the door she had left ajar. Her usual calmness had deserted her. She was in the grip of some distressing terror. For a full minute we held our breath and listened. Then her eyes rolled round again and met my own, and her skin went even whiter than before. "It woke me," she said beneath her breath, and moving a step nearer to my bed. "It was the noise." Even her whisper trembled. The noise. The word repeated itself dully of its own accord. I would rather it had been anything in the world but that. Earthquake, foreign cannon, collapse of the house above our heads. The noise, Frances. Are you sure? I was playing, really, for a little time. "It was like thunder. At first I thought it was thunder, but a minute later it came again, from underground. It's appalling." She muttered the words, her voice not properly under control. There was a pause of perhaps a minute, and then we both spoke at once. We said foolish, obvious things that neither of us believed in for a second. The roof had fallen in. There were burglars downstairs. The safes had been blown open. It was to comfort each other as children do that we said these things. Also, it was to gain further time. "There's someone in the house, of course," I heard my voice say finally, as I sprang out of the bed and hurried into dressing gown and slippers. "Don't be alarmed. I'll go down and see." And from the drawer I took a pistol it was my habit to carry everywhere with me. I loaded it carefully while Frances stood stock still beside the bed and watched. I moved towards the open door. "You stay here, Frances," I whispered, the beating of my heart making the words uneven, "while I go down and make a search. Lock yourself in, girl. Nothing can happen to you. It was downstairs, you said." "Underneath," she answered faintly, pointing through the floor. She moved suddenly between me and the door. "Listen, hark," she said, the eyes in her face quite fixed. "It's coming again." And she turned her head to catch the slightest sound. I stood there watching her, and while I watched her, shook. But nothing stirred. From the halls below rose only the whir and quiet ticking of the numerous clocks. The blind by the open window behind us flapped out a little into the room as the draught caught it. "I'll come with you, Bill, to the next floor." She broke the silence. "Then I'll stay with Mabel till you come up again." The blind sank down with a long sigh as she said it. The question jumped to my lips before I could repress it. "Mabel is awake. She heard it too." I hardly know why horror caught me at her answer. All was so vague and terrible as we stood there playing the great game of this sinister house where nothing ever happened. "We met in the passage. She was on her way to me." What shook in me shook inwardly. Frances, did not see it. I had the feeling, just then, that the noise was upon us, that any second it would boom and roar about our ears. But the deep silence held. I only heard my sister's little whisper coming across the room in answer to my question. "Then what is Mabel doing now?" And her reply proved that she was yielding at last beneath the dreadful tension, for she spoke at once, unable longer to keep up the pretense. With a kind of relief, as it were, she said it out, looking helplessly at me like a child. "She is weeping, and that—" My expression must have stopped her. I believe I clapped both hands upon her mouth, though when I realized things clearly again, I found they were covering my own ears instead. It was a moment of unutterable horror. The revulsion I felt was actually physical. It would have given me pleasure to fire off all the 5 chambers of my pistol into the air above my head. The sound, a definite, wholesome sound that explained itself, would have been a positive relief. Other feelings, though, were in me too, all over me, rushing to and fro. It was vain to seek their disentanglement. It was impossible. I confess that I experienced, among them, a touch of paralyzing fear, though for a moment only. It passed as sharply as it came, leaving me with a violent flush of blood to the face, such as bursts of anger bring, followed abruptly by an icy perspiration over the entire body. Yet I may honestly avow that it was not ordinary personal fear I felt, nor any common dread of physical injury. It was, rather, a vast impersonal shrinking, a sympathetic shrinking, from the agony and terror that countless others, somewhere, somehow, felt for themselves. The first sensation of a prison overwhelmed me in that instant, of bitter strife and frenzied suffering, and the fiery torture of the yearning to escape that was yet hopelessly uttered. It was of incredible power. It was real. The vain, intolerable hope swept over me. I mastered myself, though hardly knowing how, and took my sister's hand. It was as cold as ice as I led her firmly to the door and out into the passage. Apparently she noticed nothing of my so near collapse, for I caught her whisper as we went. "You are brave, Bill, splendidly brave." The upper corridors of the great sleeping-house were brightly lit. On her way to me, she had turned on every electric switch her hand could reach, and as we passed the final flight of stairs to the floor below, I heard a door shut softly and knew that Mabel had been listening, waiting for us. I led my sister up to it. She knocked, and the door was opened cautiously an inch or so. The room was pitch black. I caught no glimpse of Mabel standing there. Frances turned to me with a hurried whisper, "Billy, you will be careful, won't you?" and went in. I just had time to answer that I would not be long, and Frances to reply, "You will find us here," when the door closed and cut her sentence short before its end. But it was not alone the closing door that took the final words. Frances, by the way she disappeared, I knew it, had made a swift and violent movement into the darkness that was as though she sprang. She leaped upon that other woman who stood back among the shadows, for, simultaneously with the clipping of the sentence, another sound was also stopped, stifled, smothered, choked back, lest I should also hear it. Yet not in time. I heard it, a hard and horrible sound that explained both the leap and the abrupt cessation of the whispered words. I stood irresolute a moment. It was as though all the bones had been withdrawn from my body, so that I must sink and fall. That sound plucked them out, and plucked out my self-possession with them. I am not sure that it was a sound I had ever heard before, though children, I half remembered, made it sometimes in blind rages, when they knew not what they did. In a grown-up person, certainly, I had never known it. I associated it with animals, rather, horribly. In the history of the world, no doubt, it has been common enough, alas, but fortunately today there can be but few who know it, or would recognize it even when heard. The bones shot back into my body the same instant, but red-hot and burning. The brief instant of irresolution passed. I was torn between the desire to break down the door and enter, and to run for my life from a thing I dared not face. Out of the horrid tumult, then, I adopted neither course. Without reflection, certainly without analysis of what was best to do for my sister, myself, or Mabel, I took up my action where it had been interrupted. I turned from the awful door and moved slowly towards the head of the stairs. But that dreadful little sound came with me. I believe my own teeth chattered. It seemed all over the house, in the empty halls that opened into the long passages towards the music room, and even in the grounds outside the building. From the lawns and barren garden, from the ugly terraces themselves, it rose into the night, and behind it came a curious driving sound, incomplete, unfinished, as of wailing for deliverance, the wailing of desperate souls in anguish, the dull and dry beseeching of hopeless spirits in prison. That I could have taken the little sound from the bedroom where I actually heard it, and spread it thus over the entire house and grounds, is evidence, perhaps, of the state my nerves were in. The wailing, assuredly, was in my mind alone, but the longer I hesitated, the more difficult became my task, and, gathering up my dressing-gown, lest I should trip in the darkness, I passed slowly down the staircase into the hall below. I carried neither candle nor matches. Every switch in room and corridor was known to me. The covering of darkness was indeed rather comforting than otherwise, for if it prevented seeing, it also prevented being seen. The heavy pistol knocking against my thigh as I moved made me feel I was carrying a child's toy, foolishly. I experienced in every nerve that primitive vast dread which is the thrill of darkness. Merely the child in me was comforted by that pistol. The night was not entirely black. The iron bars across the glass front door were visible, and equally I discerned the big stiff wooden chairs in the hall, the gaping fireplace, the upright pillars supporting the staircase, the round table in the center with its books and flower vases, and the basket that held visitors' cards. There, too, was the stick and umbrella stand, and the shelf with railway guides, directory, and telegraph forms. Clocks ticked everywhere, with sounds like quiet footfalls. Light fell here and there in patches from the floor above. I stood a moment in the hall, letting my eyes grow more accustomed to the gloom, while deciding on a plan of search. I made out the ivy trailing outside over one of the big windows. And then the tall clock by the front door made a grating noise deep down inside its body. It was the presentation clock, large and hideous, given by the congregation of his church. And, dreading the booming strike it seemed to threaten, I made a quick decision. If others beside myself were about in the night, the sound of that striking might cover their approach. So I tiptoed to the right, where the passage led towards the dining room. In the other direction were the morning and drawing room, both little used, and various other rooms beyond that had been his, generally now kept locked. I thought of my sister waiting upstairs with that frightened woman for my return. I went quickly, yet stealthily. And, to my surprise, the door of the dining room was open. It had been opened. I paused on the threshold, staring about me. I think I fully expected to see a figure blocked in the shadow against the heavy sideboard, or looming on the other side beneath his portrait. But the room was empty. I felt it empty. Through the wide bow windows that gave onto the veranda came an uncertain glimmer that even shone reflected in the polished surface of the dinner table. And again I perceived the stiff outline of chairs, waiting tenantless all round it, two larger ones with high carved backs at either end. The monkey trees on the upper terrace, too, were visible outside against the sky, and the solemn crests of the Wellingtonias on the terraces below. The enormous clock on the mantelpiece ticked very slowly, as though its machinery were running down, and I made out the pale round patch that was its face. Resisting my first inclination to turn the lights up, my hand had gone so far as to finger the friendly knob. I crossed the room so carefully that no single board creaked, nor a single chair, as I rested a hand upon its back, moved on the parquet flooring. I returned neither to the right nor left, nor did I once look back. I went towards the long corridor, filled with priceless objets d'art, that led through various antechambers into the spacious music-room, and only at the mouth of this corridor did I next halt a moment in uncertainty. For this long corridor, lit faintly by high windows on the left from the veranda, was very narrow, owing to the massive shelves and fancy tables it contained. It was not that I feared to knock over precious things as I went, but that, because of its ungenerous width, there would be no room to pass another person, if I met one. And the certainty had suddenly come upon me that somewhere in this corridor another person at this actual moment stood. Here, somehow, amid all this dead atmosphere of furniture and impersonal emptiness, lay the hint of a living human presence. And with such conviction did it come upon me that my hand instinctively gripped the pistol in my pocket before I could even think. Either someone had passed along this corridor just before me, or someone lay waiting at its farther end, withdrawn or flattened into one of the little recesses to let me pass. It was the person who had opened the door, and the blood ran from my heart as I realized it. It was not courage that sent me on, but rather a strong impulsion from behind that made it impossible to retreat. The feeling that a throng pressed at my back, drawing nearer and nearer, that I was already half surrounded, swept, dragged, coaxed into a vast prison house, where there was wailing and gnashing of teeth, where their worm dieth not, and their fire is not quenched. I can neither explain nor justify the storm of irrational emotion that swept me as I stood in that moment, staring down the length of the silent corridor towards the music-room at the far end. I can only repeat that no personal bravery sent me down it, but that the negative emotion of fear was swamped in this vast sea of pity and commiseration for others that surged upon me. My senses, at least, were no whit confused. If anything, my brain registered impressions with keener accuracy than usual. I noticed, for instance, that the two swinging doors of baize that cut the corridor into definite lengths, making little rooms of the spaces between them, were both wide open, in the dim light, no mean achievement. Also, that the fronds of a palm plant, some 10 feet in front of me, still stirred gently from the air of someone who had recently gone past them. The long green leaves waved to and fro like hands. Then I went stealthily forward down the narrow space, proud even that I had this command of myself, and so carefully that my feet made no sound upon the Japanese matting on the floor. It was a journey that seemed timeless. I have no idea how fast or slow I went, but I remember that I deliberately examined articles on each side of me, peering with particular closeness into the recesses of wall and window. I passed the first baize doors, and the passage beyond them widened out into hold shelves of books. There were sofas and small reading tables against the wall. It narrowed again presently as I entered the second stretch. The windows here were higher and smaller, and marble statuettes of classical subjects lined the walls, watching me like figures of the dead. Their white and shining faces saw me, yet made no sign. I passed next between the second baize doors. They, too, had been fastened back with hooks against the wall. Thus all doors were open, had been recently opened. And so, at length, I found myself in the final widening of the corridor which formed an antechamber to the music-room itself. It had been used formerly to hold the overflow of meetings. No door separated it from the great hall beyond, but heavy curtains hung usually to close it off, and these curtains were invariably drawn. They now stood wide. And here I can merely state the impression that came upon me. I knew myself at last surrounded. The throng that pressed behind me also surged in front. Facing me in the big room, and waiting for my entry, stood a multitude. On either side of me, in the very air above my head, the vast assemblage paused upon my coming. The pause, however, was momentary, for instantly the deep tumultuous movement was resumed that yet was silent as a cavern underground. I felt the agony that was in it, the passionate striving, the awful struggle to escape. The semi-darkness held beseeching faces that fought to press themselves upon my vision, yearning yet hopeless eyes, lips scorched and dry, mouths that opened to implore, but found no craved delivery in actual words, and a fury of misery and hate that made the life in me stop dead, frozen by the horror of vain pity. That intolerable vain hope was everywhere. And the multitude, it came to me, was not a single multitude, but many. For as soon as one huge division pressed too close upon the edge of escape, it was dragged back by another and prevented. The wild host was divided against itself. Here dwelt the shadow I had imagined weeks ago, and in it struggled armies of lost souls, as in the depths of some bottomless pit, whence there is no escape. The layers mingled, fighting against themselves in endless torture. It was in this great shadow I had clairvoyantly seen Mabel, but about its fearful mouth, I now was certain, hovered another figure of darkness, a figure who sought to keep it in existence, since to her thought were due those lampless depths of woe without escape. Towards me the multitudes now surged. It was a sound and a movement that brought me back into myself. The great clock at the farther end of the room just then struck the hour of 3. That was the sound, and the movement. I was aware that a figure was passing across the distant center of the floor. Instantly I dropped back into the arena of my little human terror. My hand again clutched stupidly at the pistol butt. I drew back into the folds of the heavy curtain, and the figure advanced. I remember every detail. At first it seemed to me enormous, this advancing shadow, far beyond human scale. But as it came nearer, I measured it, though not consciously, by the organ pipes that gleamed in faint colors just above its gradual soft approach. It passed them already halfway across the great room. I saw then that its stature was that of ordinary men. The prolonged booming of the clock died away. I heard the footfall shuffling upon the polished boards. I heard another sound, a voice, low and monotonous, droning as in prayer. The figure was speaking. It was a woman, and she carried in both hands before her a small object that faintly shimmered, a glass of water. And then I recognized her. There was still an instant's time before she reached me, and I made use of it. I shrank back, flattening myself against the wall. Her voice ceased a moment, as she turned and carefully drew the curtains together behind her, closing them with one hand. Oblivious of my presence, though she actually touched my dressing-gown with the hand that pulled the cords, she resumed her dreadful, solemn march, disappearing at length down the long vista of the corridor like a shadow. But as she passed me, her voice began again, so that I heard each word distinctly as she uttered it, her head aloft, her figure upright, as though she moved at the head of a procession. A drop of cold water given in his name shall moisten their burning tongues. It was repeated monotonously over and over again, droning down into the distance as she went, until at length both voice and figure faded into the shadows at the farther end. For a time, I have no means of measuring precisely, I stood in that dark corner, pressing my back against the wall, and would have drawn the curtains down to hide me, had I dared to stretch an arm out. The dread that presently the woman would return passed gradually away. I realized that the air had emptied. The crowd her presence had stirred into activity had retreated. I was alone in the gloomy underspaces of the odious building. Then I remembered suddenly again the terrified women waiting for me on that upper landing. I realized that my skin was wet and freezing cold after a profuse perspiration. I prepared to retrace my steps. I remember the effort it cost me to leave the support of the wall and covering darkness of my corner, and to step out into the grey light of the corridor. At first I sidled, then, finding this mode of walking impossible, turned my face boldly and walked quickly, regardless that my dressing-gown set the precious objects shaking as I passed. A wind that sighed mournfully against the high small windows seemed to have got inside the corridor as well. It felt so cold, and every moment I dreaded to see the outline of the woman's figure as she waited in recess or angle against the wall for me to pass. Was there another thing I dreaded even more? I cannot say. I only know that the first baize doors had swung to behind me, and the second ones were close at hand, when the great dim thunder caught me, pouring up with prodigious volume, so that it seemed to roll out from another world. It shook the very bowels of the building. I was closer to it than that other time, when it had followed me from the Goblin Garden. There was strength and hardness in it, as of metal reverberation. Some touch of numbness, almost of paralysis, must surely have been upon me, that I felt no actual terror, for I remember even turning and standing still to hear it better. That is the noise, my thought ran stupidly, and I think I whispered it aloud. The doors are closing. The wind outside against the windows was audible, so it cannot have been really loud. Yet, to me, it was the biggest, deepest sound I have ever heard, but so far away, with such awful remoteness in it, that I had to doubt my own ears at the same time. It seemed underground, the rumbling of earthquake gates that shut remorselessly within the rocky earth, stupendous, ultimate thunder. They were shut off from help again. The doors had closed. I felt a storm of pity, an agony of bitter, futile hate sweep through me. My memory of the figure changed then. The woman with the glass of cooling water had stepped down from heaven, but the man, or was it men, who smeared this terrible layer of belief and thought upon the world? I crossed the dining room. It was fancy, of course, that held my eyes from glancing at the portrait, for fear I should see it smiling approval, and so finally reached the hall, where the light from the floor above seemed now quite bright in comparison. All the doors I closed carefully behind me, but first I had to open them. The woman had closed every one. Up the stairs, then, I actually ran, 2 steps at a time. My sister was standing outside Mabel's door. By her face, I knew that she had also heard. There was no need to ask. I quickly made my mind up. "There's nothing," I said, and detailed briefly my tour of search. "All is quiet and undisturbed downstairs. May God forgive me." She beckoned to me, closing the door softly behind her. My heart beat violently a moment, then stood still. "Mabel," she said aloud. It was like the sentence of a judge, that one short word. I tried to push past her and go in, but she stopped me with her arm. She was wholly mistress of herself, I saw. "Hush!" she said in a lower voice. "I've got her round again with brandy. She's sleeping quietly now. We won't disturb her." She drew me farther out into the landing, and as she did so, the clock in the hall struck 3:30. I had stood then 30 minutes in the corridor below. "You've been such a long time," she said simply. "I feared for you." And she took my hand in her own that was cold and clammy.